Revolt, I think, is better understood as a deep questioning. More a deep questioning than a certain answering. Less like ideology, more like philosophy. So following this, what I want to argue is for an understanding of the intellect of insurrection. And I don't want to do this to defend philosophy. I want to do this against the ideological caricature of the abject stupidity of revolt, against all the common vilifications of revolt as irrational, as violent. I think we have to understand revolt as the critical activity of an intellect at work, as a form of philosophy from below. Revolt does what philosophy does, but much better than any professional philosopher could dream of doing. The intellect of insurrection can be seen in some of its basic features. Revolt does raise questions. Revolt does make criticisms. Revolt does express disaffection about the justice and the reality of the existing world. It calls for a different justice and a different reality, for some other state of affairs or states of affairs, for a new situation that can be imagined as both possible and desirable, even for a new situation as an ethical obligation. Like much good philosophy, which ignores the fact that so much of philosophy is not good, revolt presents positions that are marginal or invisible without it. Revolt puts questions on the table, raises questions that are not being widely asked without it. Revolt seeks to eliminate the invisibility of different logics. And like the best in philosophy, it's a dangerous intellectual activity. Even where revolt is not violent, it self-consciously risks various forms or consequences of violence. That's a tradition in philosophy that goes back to Socrates. Socrates, who found himself an enemy of the state for raising questions in the streets of Athens. Raising questions in the streets of Athens, the wrong questions at the wrong time. Of course, given a particular case of revolt in Italy, in France, in Egypt, in Turkey, in Mexico, Spain, the United States, or Brazil, we have to make a more detailed analysis of what is going on there. What is a revolt in these particular places, in these particular times doing? What does it mean? We can only go so far and not very far at all in speaking about revolt in generic terms. Locations and instances are not generic. Revolt arises from circumstances from within historical contexts and in response to changing conditions of life. Consider the case of the response to the police shooting and killing of an unarmed black teenager, Michael Brown, in Ferguson, Missouri. I live about 30 miles north of Ferguson, Missouri, in Springfield, Illinois. Consider the case of Michael Brown in August of 2014. The St. Louis suburb was rocked for days by uprising, smashed shop windows, protests, fire, confrontations with police, thousands of bodies in the streets, outraged by the murder of Michael Brown. While news reports predictably and reliably condemned the uprisings, never hesitating to call them violent, participants in the upheaval explained their rational content, explained the reasonable content of the Ferguson Uprising. One insurrectionist, DeAndre Smith, told the St. Louis Post-Dispatch that The Ferguson Revolt was the inevitable and dignified response to the injustice, saying, quote, "I think they got a taste of what fighting back means." The general feeling expressed by the participants in the uprising seemed to agree with Mikhail Bakunin's 1872 sentiment that, quoting Bakunin, "Revolt is a natural tendency of life. Even a worm turns against the foot that crushes it. In general," he said, "the vitality and relative dignity of an animal can be measured by the intensity of its instincts to revolt," close quote. So contrary to racist caricatures of insurgents as wild animals, revolt is for the human animal a modality of indignation. It's a measure of dignity. Now here in Baltimore, I was inspired to see the publication of the 2015 Baltimore Uprising, a teen epistolary. Some of you, I think, have had it here. You've had it in the store. I have been unable to find it. Is it back available, the teen epistolary?
Not yet. It was printed out at the time. It sold like wildfire. They reprinted it. It sold like wildfire. So the group that did it is actually working on doing something more, getting some more of it out.
I was greatly interested and remain interested in reading it because it immediately seems a more promising guide to understanding the direct thinking, the communicative, the cognitive content of the Baltimore Uprising than, for example, to have it explained by professional thinkers. The model for the teen epistolary, which I have not yet seen myself, reminded me of the importance of that book that came out on AK Press, We Are an Image from the Future, that collected participant observation and commentary from the uprising in Greece in 2008. Professional thinkers, myself included, have to understand that we don't teach insurrection. We can only hope to learn from it. We can only hope to learn from it, to treat the uprising as a philosophical content, as a primary source material, as serious thinking in the streets. Our main mode of participation, and it's not the only mode, is to try to counteract certain discourses. Books, all behind me, written by intellectuals in various places around the world, professional thinkers. The store is full of them. They all deal in discourse. They all deal in thinking about discourses, different ways of thinking and speaking. So we have a kind of minimal role in that way. It's not necessarily decisive, but it does matter. Discourse matters. Consider, for example, how idiotic depictions of violence remain effective and reliable mechanisms for the total and immediate disqualification of the intellect of insurrection. That it's hard to get past the reactionary and idiotic depiction of the violence, to actually consider the content, the intellect, the philosophical activity. In 1919, Georg Lukács, Hungarian Marxist, criticized the capitalist tendency to only see violence as something outside the economy and law. Lukács observed that the capitalist society presents itself as the non-violent situation, presents its laws as the order of peace. And so by definition, anything that opposes the legal and economic reality is immediately singled out for the name violence. There is a problem there, because it makes it difficult for us to see the violence of everyday life. It makes it difficult for us to see other forms of violence. And I have to add something here in light of what has happened in the past 48 hours in the Paris attacks, which everybody knows is a catastrophic situation demanding condemnation. It is not our responsibility, though, to condemn the violence that is everywhere already and always being condemned. What about all of the other violence? Sometimes I teach a class at the University of Illinois on globalization, which is basically a semester-long demolition derby on so-called capitalist democracy. And invariably, always a student says, "But Gilman-Opalsky, where's the other side?" To which I say, "This is the other side. When you leave, the side you're asking for is already everywhere present." So there is a problem with which violence receives our moral indignation. And I am suspicious of the moral condemnation of some of the violence, especially when the condemnation is focused on communities that we most closely identify with. It's a problem of identification. When we get most upset about violence visited upon those people that we most closely identify with. But Revolt, I think, does this work better, because it confronts the everyday violence of economy and law. It confronts the everyday violence that isn't singled out and named as violence. And it asks us, Revolt, it says, will we worry less about violence to capital, to its inanimate objects and commodities? And maybe will we worry more about the violence of capital? Rather than the violence to capital, what about the violence of capital? A broken window, looted food, a burning bank, a burning car are indeed violence from the perspective of property law. But from what perspective is poverty violence? From what perspective is mass incarceration violence? From what perspective is racial profiling and police brutality violence? And in between every killing we do hear of, there are hundreds of others we don't. And yet, we must never reduce revolt to the stories of the individual casualties who triggered them. We all know that the so-called Arab Spring was not about Mohamed Bouazizi, the Tunisian street vendor who lit himself on fire in December of 2010. The story of the so-called Arab Spring is not the biography of Bouazizi. We must instead try to see the violence in the conditions of life that made self-immolation appear sensible to Bouazizi, a street vendor. We should ask, I think, what Bouazizi's sister asked. She asked, quote, "What kind of repression do you imagine it takes for a young man to do this?" Is it possible to take seriously the everyday violence that Revolt opposes? Is it possible to think of uprising, riot, revolt, insurrection as an oppositional force to violence, as an oppositional force to the violence that we do not discuss or identify as such, And the real tragedy is that we do not discuss it not only because of racism, which is a huge part of the story, but we do not discuss it because we have become accustomed to accepting that violence, accepting the unacceptable, tolerating the intolerable. Can we only hear the demos when it speaks in ballots? Jacques Rancière's book, French philosopher, I don't know if this book is here in the store, but I saw some others. Hatred of Democracy. Rancière wrote a book, beautiful little book called Hatred of Democracy, in which he diagnoses the hatred of democracy that hides behind a professed love of democracy. People speak about how they love democracy. They want democracy to flourish all around the world until the demos becomes active. And then, wait a minute. Well, I love democracy, but that demos should settle down, because the demos means people. And it seemed to Rancière that one of the things that those who profess their love of democracy hate the most is an active demos. And so he diagnoses in that book how underneath the professed love of democracy is a visceral hatred of it. What I want to do, as I'm drawing to the conclusion here, is I want to propose a variation on Rancière's theme. I claim that those who condemn the revolts secretly love them. They condemn the revolts, but they're glad to see them. They're secretly glad to see them. The purported hatred of the violence of revolt conceals a special love for that so-called violence. They love the upheaval they condemn for their own reasons, most of them racist, because then they could go on applying their racist caricatures. So they say, oh, that's terrible, that revolt. But secretly they love it, because it functions as a vindication of their racism. If critics of revolt have any real fear of revolt, I don't think it's a fear of its violence, the one thing that they single out, pathologically fixated on. I think if they have any real fear of revolt, it's a fear of its abolitionist content. There's a long abolitionist history in this country. There's a long history of slave revolts. There's a long history of riots. Revolt today takes up unfinished business. Do you think that in 1965 in Watts, Los Angeles, the race problem was solved in America? The hope of those who condemn revolt, I think, is that nothing they love will be abolished. That the present state of things will be defended against every revolt. If they do tremble, perhaps they know. Revolt continues where previous revolt leaves off, in exactly the sense we opened with by discussing Deleuze and Guattari. When they said May 68 did not take place, what they meant was, just because you don't see it now doesn't mean it is gone and over. Let me tell you a story briefly that was very inspirational on this particular case. I moved from New York City to Illinois to take a job at the university. And I was able to go back to New York. I can't remember exactly when it was, but the occupation of Liberty Park, Zuccotti Park, had resumed in the cold early January. I was in the airport and I saw on the television that people have reclaimed the park. So I got off the plane and I put my bags away and I quickly went over and walked down to the park. And by the time I got there, it was empty. There was one guy standing with a sign that I was glad there was no camera on. Let me put it that way. But the park was empty, except there were a lot of cops in the park. And I had just seen that they had occupied it again, so I went to one of the cops and I said, "What happened? I heard that Zuccotti was occupied." And the cop said, "Yeah, it was, but they all went home." And I looked around and I said, "Then why are there so many police officers here in the park?" And he looked at me and he said, "Because sometimes they come back." And I like that. Maybe for him it's good job security. Revolt tries. Revolt is an effort. Revolt is an effort. It's an attempt. But it isn't over when it ends. Revolt, I think, is a precarious process of world-making. A precarious process of world-making. It tries but doesn't know what will happen. It's an intermediary phase in the development of human liberation. It seems to me, when looking in my work at lots of different uprisings over the years, that the one great confidence of revolt is that the present situation is unacceptable. That the one great confidence in every revolt is an expression that the situation is unacceptable. And I don't think we should shift always to an agenda with itemized. When liberals ask for an itemized agenda, do you think it's so that they can deliver the goods? When liberals ask for an itemized agenda, it's so that they can reject each plank. People are saying at Mizzou, also, you've seen some of what's been going on at Mizzou with the students and some of the athletes walking out of classes. But what is their specific grievance? Why? Why do the liberals want to know the specific grievance? So that they can disqualify it. But the fact is, it's a generalized disaffection. It's about a history. It's about a history at Mizzou and the surrounding community, a history of racism. It's a general, and when people watch, they don't like that because they don't know what to do with an expression of total disaffection. It's ungovernable, which is its virtue. So, in between revolts, we do grow accustomed, I think, to accepting the unacceptable, to tolerating the intolerable, and so we should not quickly jump when they ask for a list of demands. We shouldn't minimize the significance of an epiphany. An epiphany is very significant. When revolt breaks pathological obedience, when revolt breaks the pathological reproduction of everyday life, we should recognize in that an enormous achievement, an enormous accomplishment, and we should know that the end of revolt is not its end. Everyone knows that rational people behave differently. Rational people write letters. Rational people write books. I write books. How many people read my books compared to how many people talk about an uprising? It's embarrassing, but that's how it is. Books are begging in this insane, highly compressed attention economy for 1 minute of focus. The words are begging for attention. Rational people are going to vote in the election. Rational people are going to obey the laws, but revolt rejects the rationality of an irrational system. Revolt rejects the rationality of an irrational, revealing that there are other reasons, there are other rationalities, ones that are excluded by the ideological narrowness of those who always defend the existing situation. Revolt, I think, is largely, not entirely, And as I said, I'm speaking in somewhat generic terms. We have to look at cases, and maybe we can. I'm interested in knowing what you think. But it is, I think, largely, generally, generically, about wrenching open that narrowness. It's about wrenching it open so we can see other rationalities beyond the rationalization of everything that is. So that we can learn something from a different intellect. And that is true. Revolts teach us. They are teachers. Revolts are teachers. They are educators. They are philosophers. And at certain junctures, it becomes clear. We cannot simultaneously reproduce everyday life and transform it. And I think that is the basic logic of revolt. Thanks. At work as a form of philosophy from below. Revolt does what philosophy does, but much better than any professional philosopher could dream of doing. The intellect of insurrection can be seen in some of its basic features. Revolt does raise questions. Revolt does make criticisms. Revolt does express disaffection about the justice and the reality of the existing world. It calls for a different justice and a different reality, for some other state of affairs or states of affairs, for a new situation that can be imagined as both possible and desirable, even for a new situation as an ethical obligation. Like much good philosophy, which ignores the fact that so much of philosophy is not good, revolt presents positions that are marginal or invisible without it. Revolt puts questions on the table, raises questions that are not being widely asked without it. Revolt seeks to eliminate the invisibility of different logics. And like the best in philosophy, it's a dangerous intellectual activity. Even where revolt is not violent, it self-consciously risks various forms. Revolt, I think, is better understood as a deep questioning. More a deep questioning than a certain answering. Less like ideology, more like philosophy. So following this, what I want to argue is for an understanding of the intellect of insurrection. And I don't want to do this to defend philosophy. I want to do this against the ideological caricature of the abject stupidity of revolt, against all the common vilifications of revolt as irrational, as violent. I think we have to understand revolt as the critical activity of an intellect or consequences of violence. That's a tradition in philosophy that goes back to Socrates. Socrates, who found himself an enemy of the state for raising questions in the streets of Athens. Raising questions in the streets of Athens, the wrong questions at the wrong time. Of course, given a particular case of revolt in Italy, in France, in Egypt, in Turkey, in Mexico, Spain, the United States, or Brazil, we have to make a more detailed analysis of what is going on there. What is a revolt in these particular places, in these particular times doing? What does it mean? We can only go so far and not very far at all in speaking about revolt in generic terms. Locations and instances are not generic. Revolt arises from circumstances from within historical contexts and in response to changing conditions of life. Consider the case of the response to the police shooting and killing of an unarmed black teenager, Michael Brown, in Ferguson, Missouri. I live about 30 miles north of Ferguson, Missouri, in Springfield, Illinois. Consider the case of Michael Brown in August of 2014. The St. Louis suburb was rocked for days by uprising, smashed shop windows, protests, fire, confrontations with police, thousands of bodies in the streets, outraged